Welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be talking about how legal and sales can partner together to close deals faster. We're going to do a brief overview of the agenda, do some introductions, and then dive right in. So starting with the agenda, we are going to introduce ourselves, talk a little bit about the sales and legal relationship, go through a quick toolkit that we're going to provide everyone on this call to help facilitate their business partnerships amongst these groups, and then open up some Q&A before we dive in. So I'll start with my introduction. My name is Ashlyn Donahue. I'm the Director of Legal here at LinkSquares. I have a background in commercial transactions and legal operations, but have for many years been supporting sales organizations at a few different companies. And so have worked really hard to facilitate those relationships and create strong partnerships with them. And I'm excited to talk about that today. So Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ashlyn. Hey, everybody. Mike Ross. I'm the Chief Customer Officer at LexCheck. I'm a former attorney, practiced for 5 years doing M&A. Prior to that, I was in e-discovery at Deloitte. So have been in legal tech and legal services for about 15 years now. At this point, my role at LexCheck as Chief Customer Officer focuses on really spending time with customers, building community amongst our customers, and hearing out customers in terms of what their needs are and how we can better serve them.
Awesome. So let's dig right in. So I think there's this historical perception sometimes that there is maybe a friction between legal and sales. And so, there are some ways that you can really create opportunities around the relationships across these teams. Mike, what have been some good tips and tricks from your perspective for fostering strong relationships and partnerships?
Yeah, so as companies grow, alignment, workflow between the two partnering departments, sales and legal, can become detached. Let's say I think you really have to be proactive about this stuff. One thing that we hear from customers is that training can be difficult for sales to adopt legal driven policies. So I think that's really a key. Do you have any tips, Ashlyn, about how you've been able to kind of conquer that?
Yeah, so I think, whenever I've joined an organization and starting to support the sales team, I'm really intentional about investing time to build trust with them, getting to know them, having coffee, asking questions like, what are some of the biggest challenges you have? How can I help? What are things that you think we could do to improve the process or maybe the negotiation cycle from a legal perspective? And so really opening that door to solicit feedback. And then, making sure that we're staying in touch on that regularly. But it's all about intentionality. As organizations grow and scale, you have more sales teams, more sales reps, and you have to really be thoughtful and mindful about creating the space to provide those opportunities. And maybe it's no longer, just a direct to the sales organization once a week where you check in. Maybe you start to work very closely with the sales enablement team and creating very specific legal driven organizational training where your sales team's operating out of, where they're working out of, and having office hours afterwards to follow up, to continue to have that open dialogue and space for them to interact directly.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I think it's important to remember everybody's on the same team here. The goal is to bring in revenue. Legal does have the obligation to mitigate risk, but that needs to be kind of contextualized in the business context for a given deal. I think if sales can help legal understand the scope of the deal, legal is in a better position to negotiate the deal. In an ideal world, sales can be provided with a bit of autonomy to negotiate on on themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a great point. Legal and sales they're on the same team. They're trying to move things forward. They're trying to get to the same objective. And it's really about making sure that that's a reinforced conversation, that there's a lot of context and why behind, suggested edits or why legal is taking a certain approach in a negotiation. Having that open line of transparency really creates, this alignment that helps foster that deal collaboration and cycle. Sales can be, is a very strong partner to legal throughout the cycle. and giving them the information to really move in that direction is so crucial.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how you can collect surface needs from every group. So Mike, any tips and tricks on how you can, ensure that there's strong alignment between these teams? Because I think, a lot of what we've just talked about is creating the alignment across the groups.
Yeah, I think, step one, as you kind of alluded to from what I'm hearing from our clients, is to really achieve buy-in. If a relationship is fractured between these two groups, it's going to be hard to kind of collaborate on a given instance. So, getting wins for legal that are visible to sales, whether that's technology projects that are implemented or trainings, or highlighting victories, I think is really a great step, just setting the tone for a relationship that is kind of I guess set up to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea about, having those proactive conversations and being extra intentional about it. Is that something that, you have provided guidance and recommendations to teams on in the past, like best tricks to kick it off?
Yeah, I think in the world of legal technology, where LexCheck sits, there's often a tendency to kind of go after the most difficult problem to solve first. There's always a risk, though, with the difficult problems, that you're not going to achieve the result that you want. So, getting projects in the door that are going to be a win. Crawl, walk, run. We hear from a lot of our clients. Those types of things can really move the ball in terms of showing sales that legal is future looking, that they want to achieve operational efficiency along with the sales team and be a really good partner for upcoming transactions. What about you, Ashley?
Yeah, so I think like one of the things that I really try to do anytime I've sat in an organization where implementing technology is have conversations with all business teams, but particularly sales, to understand what their goals are out of any technical solution or process update that we're discussing. Understand where their friction points are, and then come back to the table with some recommendations on how we can deploy that technology, that process update, or maybe it's both, right? To mitigate any of that friction that was occurring, improve the process, create faster deal cycles, but not just, launch it and then never come back to the conversation. It's all about creating those follow-ups. We implemented this system. In doing so, we can clearly articulate that this is the reduction in time to close a sales deal, things of that nature. So aligning on those metrics that are going to be most impactful for the team and that they care most about, and then making sure that as part of your rollout that you're, collecting that information, reporting back out on it, and then iterating as appropriate, right? Like not everything is going to work exactly as expected 100% of the time when you first launch it, and you find new opportunities. Your organizations will change, and you can iterate on those technical implementations or process solutions that you have with that growing business to support their needs and create that alignment.
How do you find it's best to communicate those types of metrics and figures to sales? What works in terms of something that actually gets through to the sales team?
I think there's a couple different ways that you can do that, right? Like one is maybe messaging out to the sales leaders, but even just in the general request cycle. So one of the things that I have found really impactful for me in past instances where I've really wanted to kind of hone in on the importance of using the technology that we've implemented rather than maybe going outside of those channels to a Slack or just, an email, is providing the why behind having it in there. And so in many ways, right, like when you're implementing technology, a lot of the objectives that are around that from a sales perspective are to create a seamless place for them to interact with legal, ensure that it's going to the right legal counterpart quickly, right? Like the way that your team might be structured may mean that, the person you were working with, 6 weeks ago is now shifted to a new legal business partner, and getting to them quickest is going to help you move forward fastest. And so using that technology, which, often has logic in place or the legal team is monitoring, make sure that you are going to get to that person who can best support you fastest, and have that record, right? So if you go on vacation the next day, your manager can step in and help out. It's really about providing that information and guidance in the moment, and doing that repeatedly, right? It can take some time, particularly if it's a new solution that you're implementing. It's a big change in process. But over time, I think people really start to understand the why, and it just becomes something that's talked about. It's not, oh, I have to log a request here. It's like, I'm going to log a request here because I know that I will get an answer faster, and really giving them that talk track that they then share amongst the organization.
Makes sense.
Yeah. All right. So we talked a little bit about how we can kick off that process is just surfacing those business needs. And so I think that once you really start to have those strong relationships and alignment, and you're sharing that back, you're creating those strong partnerships. You're becoming best friends with the sales organization, and you're, part of the team, part of the sales cycle, part of the organization there. But how do we help, leverage this strong partnership that you've created with external parties? Mike, any suggestions and recommendations on that?
Yeah, I think, what we hear from clients is step one is really maintaining alignment as a team, right? You know, you don't want to have internal dissension amongst your team. It can be viewed as a sign of weakness, or a cause for frustration in a negotiation with the counterparty. You know, it's the sales process is a multi-touch point transaction. So I think, beyond having alignment as a team, starting off with a smooth NDA negotiation is really a great way to kick off a relationship between the party. One of our clients said, NDAs are the gateway to a relationship to a party. It's kind of the front door. So, you want to be polite when letting somebody in the house, and, it's cordial. And so I think having that smooth relationship is a great start, and shows that unity as a team that you want to have following it. What about you, Ashlyn?
Yeah, and I think it's just about going back to that education and alignment with the organizations. Sales is often the first port of call for any deal, whether it's at the NDA stage, whether it's at the negotiation stage. And they have the ability to have conversations before it even gets to legal about things that are going to be important to your organization, or to provide context when you send edits back. And, to do that, you really need to empower them to understand the concepts that are important to your organization from a high level perspective, but then even be able to answer, some questions that they might receive from counterparties as it relates to the terms that you have. Empower them to have those conversations, and feel like they can do so autonomously where it's appropriate. And then really, help maybe dig in a little bit. Sometimes the counterparty will come back with a request, and if they have enough training and guidance on how to ask the right questions to get to the real crux of the ask or the real issue at hand, it can come back on some of that back and forth with legal once they're involved, and that's going to help you close deals faster.
Yeah, for sure. I think, one thing we see, even taking that a step further, is what we hear from clients is there's oftentimes the same handful of negotiation points that are open at the end of a negotiation. Helping sales surface those at the beginning of the process, with them being the primary touch point, that can really cut down on the back and forth later in the process. Have you found, any education on this works for you, Ashlyn, or is there anything that you're doing around this over at LinkSquares?
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit of a two-pronged approach. One, it's just making sure that folks have an understanding of the terms that you have in place, and they can speak to them. They can kind of do a walkthrough. They understand what's going to be included. If a question comes up on a specific point, they can refer back to the terms of service and kind of say, oh, we addressed that here. Please take a look. But then it's also as part of the contract negotiation, early and often, when you're sending red lines back to your sales team that they're going to send to the counterparty, give them the context on like what the changes are. It could be very high level to start. And if there are some key things that it's important for them to understand before they send it back, send a note inside the tool where you're sharing your red lines back, and give them that information. Like, at a high level, we made these changes because here are some very specific areas where we, modified what was requested. Here are some reasons why. things that can be relayed back to the counterparty as part of this response back. I really like to include comments in my redlining. I know I talk about that a lot, but I think it's important to have the legal comments in the draft to give that context back. But it's also equally as important to empower your sales team, whether it's on the phone, if they get on the phone before they send it back, or over the email before the counterparty even uploads it, to give that high level summary. I think it just helps move things along a lot faster.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Getting out in front of issues is a great way to keep them from popping up at the end of the deal. I think when you get towards the end, oftentimes you're bumping up against some deadline, end of month, end of quarter, end of year, and it's not the time you want to be sorting out last minute issues. So bubbling them up at the beginning of the process, getting them discussed on the table seems like a great strategy.
Yeah, and I think it also just creates alignment, right? We talked about, sales and legal are each other's biggest advocates. We are all driving towards the same objective. We're all working towards the same goal, which is to help close deals. And so having that context and education back throughout the entire cycle makes sure that, you have that strong alignment. They have the opportunity to ask questions like, hey, I don't really understand why we made this change. Can you give me a little bit more information? So you can give them that additional layer of context, and I think really helps foster that alignment going forward throughout the entirety of the deal cycle.
For sure, yeah. Do you have any anecdotes or stories about where your team has kind of gone out of alignment and how that's affected a negotiation?
Yeah, I don't have any. That's a question. I don't have any off the top of my head that I can think of. I will say that I really do strive to make sure that we are talking often. Like, I'm not afraid to Slack folks before I even send edits back and say, hey, I want to talk to you about this before I even send it back and give you a little bit of information. I will walk up, I sit on the same area as our sales team. I will go walk over to them and have a conversation before I send edits back or right after. I really want to make sure that we don't get to a place where we have that misalignment. And I am intentionally creating a lot of opportunities for us to have those touch points, whether it's with the sales rep who's negotiating the deal, their manager or director, or maybe it's everyone. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so there's just a lot of frequent communication going on from my perspective. And that's how I like to approach deals and have throughout my entire career. That's something that I got coached on by, one of my early managers when I was first starting to work on sales deals, was like, make sure you have conversations, go out of your way to get in touch with folks before you send edits back. Don't just lob things over the fence and assume you're all going to be on the same page and know what's going on. Like, you have to intentionally have that conversation so you don't get to a place where, you're not on the same page. You're messaging things that are different, because we've all, heard stories where folks are on the other side and there's maybe some back discussion from your counterparty or whatever, where maybe there is misalignment and you don't want to get to that place.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think, to kind of think about where you can, create those opportunities for alignment and how you have those conversations, technology is a really big driving factor in that. So, there's a lot of different ways that you can talk with your sales teams. How do you like to interact best with Legal Mike?
So, we're a small organization over here. I think for us, some of the issues that would happen at a larger company are just best tackled by keeping an open door of communication between the parties. We have a deal desk at end of quarter that is there to assist for anything that might be needed for a deal, that kind of we keep eyes on, and just really kind of keeping that open dialogue and coming back and talking about learnings at the end of a quarter, what we what that quarter has taught us in terms of how we can better negotiate, from a process standpoint, what are the sticking points from a substance standpoint, really kind of taking the time to recap and study and see, what that is. I think, one thing that happens at a larger organization is, those trends become harder to surface without technology, right? So you need to use technology at that point to understand across your organization what those points are.
I totally agree with that. I think that, I'm a big fan of data-driven decision making, and I think that technology really fosters the ability to have conversations that are actionable and innovative and are going to drive improvements in your deal velocity by using data to facilitate it, right? So even amongst large organizations, having those systems in place or small to drill into trends, it's a little bit hard to like finger to the wind, say like, it feels like we had a lot of X type of requests last month. Like we should maybe do something about that. And then you do it and it doesn't have that impact that you're hoping for. It doesn't drive that adjustment in your process that, reduces the friction and helps deals move forward. For me, I really like to look at data, and I'm often looking at data and saying like, okay, how many X types of requests did we get? Why are we most frequently getting when are we most frequently getting changes on this section? Is it in conjunction with another one? To think about improvements to our process, improvements to our templates, improvements to just the way that we're communicating things back, whether or not it's, maybe it's the modified language that we're agreeing to, like, is there a way that we can get to closure faster, right? And data really helps have those conversations in a more impactful manner.
Yeah, not just, on your templates, but your playbooks as well. If you're pushing for something, on a regular basis, but you're giving on that point, almost all the time, it's just a drag on the negotiation without any real value that's being added to it. So, I think lawyers, want to do, what's right at the end of the day. Legal teams want to do what's right at the end of the day, what they think is fair. But the practicalities of the situation definitely need to be considered, and data is a great way to kind of get a view into what's actually happening for the points that you're arguing for.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have strong approval processes built out, particularly if you have sales approvals, right? Some teams will have certain changes that might need to be approved on the sales side or other business teams. And you can use data to look at and say, like, what percentage of time are we approving this? Maybe we were requiring like a sales director to approve. Can we make it a sales manager? Could we even make it low touch, no touch, right? Something that is sales enabled to modify it. There's so much opportunity. And you can have those conversations and adjust and, evaluate based on the risk that your organization's comfortable with using data rather than, again, just like feels like we should do this change. Feels like I'm seeing this get approved a lot, right? So it's just a lot more impactful.
For sure.
I see. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we've been talking a lot about legal teams, and we've been kind of talking about it through the framework of commercial legal teams, but there are other players involved on the legal side, right? You have data privacy, even information security, which is not a legal function, but oftentimes gets funneled, through the legal department. And I think, in terms of self-service, creating tools that not just empower the business team, but empower the legal team to negotiate on behalf of those specialists who may not be, kind of staffed for a transaction support basis. There may not be enough of them to kind of sit in on every single deal. So, taking the kind of common 80% of that work and then putting it into a tool that could empower your general commercial legal team to be doing that negotiation on their behalf, it can be another huge win in terms of keeping that alignment within legal that then creates alignment with the business team.
Absolutely. It also gives visibility to your sales team, right? Like when you're looping in other stakeholders, doing so in a centralized location, if you're providing that visibility, like, hey, I needed to get input from X, maybe it's my finance team as part of this deal, like they have that understanding and that knowledge. And I think that's helpful for not just this deal, but going forward. Now they know if this gets adjusted, like here are some of the folks internally who might need to weigh in. So they can have those expectations set. Yeah. So we did get a question. How can legal and sales leverage the same technology? Does that work? What are your thoughts, Mike?
Sure. So I think there's a few different ways. I think you guys over at LinkSquares are doing a lot around process. I'll talk a little bit about substance, of a playbook, here. One thing that we're doing at LexCheck is basically taking, legal kind of the common legal positions on simple documents and putting them in what we call a digital playbook. So that can be leveraged at any time by the sales team. So really, it's sales is benefiting from this expertise that legal is kind of monitoring, overseeing, has the oversight and management of. So they're both leveraging the same technology. Sales is actually touching it with greater frequency, but legal is kind of the one who are responsible for setting that up, configuring it, and just making sure that it's doing what they want at a level that they deem acceptable. So that's that kind of self-service instance that that we were talking about just a second ago. What about you, Ashlyn? How have you found that sales and legal can leverage the same technology?
I think it's all about the user experience you're creating, right? And this is true for interacting with sales, but any other department internally. You want to make it easy for folks to engage legal. You don't want to create a lot of friction in that process because it's just unnecessary, and meet them where they're at if you can. So if you have opportunities to create integrations with the systems that they're working out of, then they're not context switching, which is just a huge time suck for any organization. You're enabling them and empowering them to reach out and coordinate with the legal team as they need to without having to leave where they're most comfortable. So, for us here at LinkSquares, we have a Salesforce integration. Our teams, we're a Salesforce shop. They're able to leverage that and really interact with us through the tool that they're working out of day in and day out. And I'm working out of the tool that we use, which is our own product, which is just fantastic. So it just creates some collaboration and connectivity in ways that are not requiring folks to move system to system. And that's really a goal that I found throughout my career. Whenever I'm thinking about technology, I'm looking at when I'm trying to bring other stakeholders into the submission process.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. So we have a few minutes left. I wanted to just open it up for questions before we moved on.
It looks like we have a question, as a sales leader, how can I ensure legal understands the pipeline, goals, and key metrics so the two can work together to remove points of friction throughout the process?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can approach this. You can use through technology and you can see what's, outstanding or pending in a system. It's also going back to that frequent communication and touch points. Throughout my entire career, there have been constant check-ins with sales leadership around like, what does your pipeline look like? What are you expecting legal to be involved with? And it's not just like a one and done conversation. It's something that I might be checking in on every day or multiple times a day just to say, like, how can I help? What is in the queue that you're most concerned with or most, the highest priority for you? It's, again, back to that communication and relationship building. What about you, Mike?
Cross training, I think, is great. I think alignment starts with management, right? Kind of managers understanding what each other's goals, KPIs, how they're operating their departments are. But I think cross training, once that alignment has occurred, legal understanding, where sales sits in a given quarter, sales understanding, legal's latest positions and what they're seeing in terms of what might be sticking points in the negotiation. So those can be kind of addressed more towards the front of a negotiation. I think those are great starts. We have legal people, our contract negotiators oftentimes sit in on our sales pipeline, especially towards the end of quarters, so we can understand where things are sitting. And I think that there's just keeping that open door of communication and sharing what's important throughout the process with each other as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just so crucial. So we did get another question in, Mike, and I'll ask you. In your experience, how have you seen legal teams and sales teams, coordinate and collaborate together when being flexible around deals and terms, whether it's creating self-service options or opportunities for sales to self adjust, or just really as part of the deal cycle? How have you seen that best played out in practice?
Yeah, I think in terms of flexibility, we see it pop up most often at the kind of the tail end of the process. We have what we, the negotiation process. We know what our positions are, what we go out with, what we're willing to accept on a second turn, but sometimes that's not enough to get a deal done. So you do have to kind of bend a little bit further to get it over the finish line. I think that, comes with clear escalation paths, and really those escalation team members, the legal managers, making sure that they're not being tied up with other things that might be kind of taking up that time from their schedule that they don't have to be. So, it's really a kind of a waterfall of work, right? And you want to keep the bottom of the waterfall, if you will, the top of the department, as free as possible, so that they can jump in, at the last minute, figure out how to inform the business, and get that kind of informed consent and business sign off.
Yeah, totally. I absolutely agree with that. And I think that, it's a little bit about creating, content and information for your sales team, but it's also about empowering your legal team too, right? You want to make sure your legal team has a strong understanding of your playbook, your organization's risk perspective and tolerance, and how they think about approaching a negotiation. Every organization is going to do it a little bit differently. And so as you join a new team from a legal perspective, it's really getting to that stance of understanding, how do I approach this negotiation, first pass, second pass, what's really important to us as part of it? What are my escalation channels, as you mentioned? And technology is a great way to help onboard someone as part of that. Whether it's just, whenever I join a team, I always go back and I look at old deals. Like, what have we agreed to in the past? I can ask questions. It really drives conversation rather than doing it on the fly in high volume, time crunched periods where you're like trying to close deals quickly. It's having that historical context that you can get from a tool is a great way to do that as well.
For sure.
Awesome. I'm not sure we have any more questions that came in, but any last thoughts, Mike?
I think, legal's never been, despite the challenges that they're facing, legal is kind of over the last 5 to 10 years is taking great strides in terms of, addressing feedback from other departments, moving the ball forward, and adopting technology in an attempt to kind of better support functions like sales, be better work with these departments. So it's a really exciting time, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this continues to go as technology just continues to rapidly evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there has been, from my perspective, definitely an increased investment in this partnership mentality for legal departments and organizations. And, that's true for the sales and legal partnership, but outside of that as well, just really creating this mindset that the legal team is a true business partner, that they sit within the organization and they are there to support it and facilitate it and leverage technology or processes to create that innovation around that and help move the business organization forward faster. So I think it's a lot that we'll see change. There's been a lot of change since I started my career. I'm sure you've seen a lot of adjustment as well, and I'm looking forward to what we'll see in the future. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.